So I thought it was useful just to start by talking about the diagnosis. So many of you might know that in the last DSM, they changed the definition of autism. It used to be split into Asperger's syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder, and autism, and now everything comes under autism spectrum disorder. Within the individuals that I work with, some of them really love that, some of them don't, so it has kind of a bit of controversy. But just to refresh our memories, so the diagnosis comes from these four areas. So firstly, that there is a social communication impairment or difference. So that will include differences in verbal communication, so that could be literal understanding of language, differences in language processing, all the way to people who are non-verbal. A number of the people that I work with are incredibly eloquent, highly articulate, but if they're in a stressful situation, they can become completely mute. I've got two women who recently ended up in hospital for physical and mental health reasons, and understandably the stress of that meant that these very articulate women became completely non-verbal, and the staff just did not know how to manage that, and thought they were being difficult, thought they were being kind of, confrontational, and it took quite a lot of work to help them understand that. And one of them in the end ended up using their iPad to communicate. They would write things down, so we got around it in the end. But that kind of really unusual or spiky profile is something that can really be quite tricky, I think, for some people to get their head around. So also in social communication, you've got the non-verbal elements, understanding facial expressions and body language, and then issues to do with reciprocity, so that kind of give and take within relationships, understanding rules about, what is a friend, what does it mean, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. I have a good friend who is autistic, and sometimes he will send me messages of to do with dating and things, and they'll be like, Ruth, what does this mean? Because it's trying to understand the kind of unwritten context between them can be really difficult. Repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests and activities. So this is where we'll have the kind of stimming, so repetitive movements. It could also be internalised, so it could be repetitive words that are said, or repetitive phrases that are gone over. And then also kind of focus on routine, the importance for routine, difficulties around change, and even kind of perceived small change can be really tricky. And the idea being that it's a presence from early childhood, and the kind of diagnostic differentiation between individuals who might have had neglect that has led to features that might be autistic, or other disorders that kind of show autistic traits. So we're seeing it from early childhood and the difficulties in every day. And also, the bit that's not in here is the sensory differences, which you will relate to, I'm sure, but they could have a very different sensory profile, hyper and hyposensitive, differences in introspection, so knowing if they're feeling, how they're feeling inside, whether they're hungry, whether they're thirsty. I work with a lot of adults who've been diagnosed in later life, and that's one of the things that can be a real kind of discovery for them, because, and a lot of them will talk about the fact that, if you've lived your life experiencing the world in a particular way, you may have no idea that actually you are hypersensitive. And suddenly to kind of start to understand there's a reason why you always feel deeply uncomfortable in certain settings, or why somebody eating in a particular way makes you want to kill them, or that you just weren't aware of this stuff before. So that element is so key, I think, as well, the sensory element. Alright, let's do some myth busting. So autism is rare. So we've got the latest, there's various prevalent studies have been going about, and they have forever. If anyone wants to do a bit of reading around this topic, Steve Silverman has done a book called Neurotribes. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. Really good book, and he did it on the back of this kind of idea that there's an epidemic of autism, and that kind of fear of like an autism epidemic, and it coming after linked to the MMR vaccine, which is obviously complete nonsense. But actually, what he kind of highlights is that it is linked to the differences in diagnosis and the improvements in our understanding of autism, improvements of services. So it's actually more than 1 in 100 now, latest one. For individuals with Down syndrome, it's 1 to 1,000, just to give you a kind of, which is quite interesting, I think. Most individuals have a learning disability. The latest stats is 4 to 10, so it's most don't. And this links into the fact that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, not a learning disability or a mental health. And that's one of the real issues around service provision as well. So most of the services have been come from a model which is either, oh, I see you. Which is either based on learning disabilities and money comes through that, or it's based on mental health. And so autism not fitting into either of those, often lots and lots and lots of people miss out on services and funding completely. And this is still happening. The Autism Act made it very clear that individuals who are autistic should not be denied services because of their autism. But I work with people, on a weekly basis who say to me that their mental health services have said, we can't deal with you because you're autistic. So it's still a real issue. However, lots of individuals on the spectrum do have mental health disorders. There's a high prevalence because of how difficult it is. And there is a comorbidity with dyslexia or dyspraxia or ADHD or ADD. So you often have individuals who've got kind of a picture of different differences. Have people heard of neurodiversity? Okay, some shaking heads. Good. So neurodiversity is the idea that rather than seeing this within a kind of disordered paradigm, that somebody who's autistic is pathological, that their brain is not correct. It's actually highlighting the fact that there are many ways that brains can function, that people can function, and there was a real movement which was really kind of highlighting, this is a difference, there are positives around it, whether you are, dyspraxic, or whether you've got ADHD, or whether you're autistic, that there's a difference in the way that you are your being in the world, and seeing it as a diversity as opposed to seeing it as a disorder. And it's, I think from the point of view of making sure that we're not pathologising people constantly, I think it's really important. I had an interview with a young woman just last week, which was also highlighting that her as an autistic person very much does see her autism as a disorder because it makes her life hell. So it's a real kind of nuance in both kind of appreciating somebody in their fullest sense, but also that many people really experience so many problems and stigma and difficulties because of their autism.
Okay, next one. Autism is a male disorder.
So up until last 10 years, 8 years, it was really thought of as primarily a male disorder. And now we are starting to see that actually there are more women out there who've just been missed previously. So 1980, you would have those who are the higher functioning. So that's a controversial term now, high functioning, low functioning. So I've put it in advertently in quotes, but basically we're talking about individuals who don't have an additional learning disability and who have an IQ of average and above average. But previously we were looking at 15 men to 1 woman. That was the figures that we thought. At the learning disability end, 2 to 1. The most recent study, this was just 2017, is kind of finding a 3 to 1 ratio between men and women. So a really different picture. There's still a lot of research is happening right at the moment about women. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, yes. Do we know who this one is? This lady? Does anyone know who that is?
No.
It is. Well done. If I had some kind of sweet, I'd give it to you. So that's Daryl Hannah. And who's this? Sheldon Hoover. Yes, absolutely. Daryl Hannah is autistic. So she has, she thinks she was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And Sheldon actually doesn't have a diagnosis, but he is kind of quite famously supposed to be depicting the Big Bang Theory, depicting somebody who has autism. But the idea here really is that there is often a stereotype of people with autism are, kind of very geeky guys who have a love of all things computer and Star Trek and all that kind of thing, and that has been missing out. People like Daryl who wouldn't necessarily, assume has autism. And a lot of people that I work with say to me on a regular basis that they're told, you can't have autism, you give me eye contact, or you can't have autism, you're a girl, or you can't have autism, you've got a husband. All these kinds of things get routinely said to them because there's just a real kind of misunderstanding about what it is, and also because it doesn't have any visual signifiers. There isn't, I think people really find it hard if there isn't something visual to see. So, in terms of women on the spectrum, what we're seeing is that there appears to be kind of two, there's a difference in the way that their autism manifests. So, autistic girls are more likely to have normal interests. So whereas a boy might have, I'm just trying to think of people that I work with, so one has a particular love of the speedometers on motorbikes. Another person I know has a particular love of supermarkets, different types. But the girls have, one of them absolutely loved Jane Austen, just used to read lots of Jane Austen books, was really into it. Another lady I work with loved babies when she was a child. And so she had showed great interest in babies, which as a little girl doesn't look that odd. What she would actually do, she had a book, and she would write down all of the defining characteristics of said baby, where she saw them. She would also follow them and the mother, which occasionally caused problems. But because it kind of, there is this kind of semblance of whatever we define as normal, it doesn't get kind of picked up in the same way. The other difference is around having less kind of aggressive behaviour, so there's less acting out, often with women and girls, so again, it isn't something that's seen in the same way. And kind of really kind of highlighting in this issue is the issue of camouflaging. So there's studies that have shown that women predominantly appear to camouflage more. And what I mean by that is to hide their autism. Although I always caveat that because there are also men who camouflage really well. So although there appears to be this gender difference, it is more nuanced than that. Appears that there are just differences in how people experience their autism, whether it's something that kind of fits into different ways that we might see it. So I'm actually doing my research for my doctorate on women and camouflaging. So I'm looking in particular at the experience of women between 25 and 40 in terms of their camouflaging. And up to this point, there's been a lot of studies looking at, in a very kind of quantitative way, of what it actually means, looking at kind of how they might use, whether it's kind of like eye recognition data or observation data, but not so much on the actual experience of camouflaging from the women themselves and what it actually means for them, because it's a really kind of complex idea. But just to give you a brief overview of what it looks at. So it's talking about hiding your autistic traits. So the woman I spoke to recently, actually, she said to me that she lives with her mum and she's in her late 20s, and she has always hid from everybody the fact that she paces and flaps. She's always done that. And she said, you know, I don't know why, but I just feel ashamed. There's nobody, she won't even do that with her. So she'll just go and do that on her own. So there's this, you know, whatever that kind of idiosyncratic behaviour might be, there's the hiding of that. And then the kind of over-adopting of things that they're supposed to do. So whether it's looking, giving eye contact, whether it's, you know, doing a traditional kind of, hi, how are you? Yes, I'm well, thank you, how are you? Kind of those scripts, social scripts. Facial expressions as well can be a real struggle. Knowing exactly when to smile, when not to smile. It's incredibly hard if you're having to think about that overtly, not to come across looking quite weird. So lots of people I work with will say, how, it's too much. I'm supposed to smile, but not for too long. And if I look too intently, then I'm a weirdo, but if I don't look enough, then I'm rude. So there's always this element of it. And of course, we all camouflage to a certain degree. All of us do. Whether you're autistic or not autistic. But the particularity is the fact that they're having to kind of suppress or having to enhance particular things that others who are not autistic wouldn't have to do. And also that the experience of it is very intense and totally exhausting. So, you know, another lady who I work with who's just finished her PhD in musicology, incredibly bright woman, she does training for professionals, and afterwards she will need about 2-3 days on her own, because having to do that performance is just exhausting. Because she's had the sensory stimulation, she's had to do all of this. On the other hand, lots of people, particularly women, tell me that having to do this is essential in order to get a job, in order to avoid stigma. Women on the autistic spectrum are very high likelihood that they'll experience abuse or bullying or discrimination of some kind. Lots of individuals go through sexual abuse. Partly because they won't necessarily know when someone's being inappropriate with them. And they won't know if the boundary has been pushed. And so they're incredibly vulnerable. So having to kind of put a mask on partly in order to keep yourself safe, even if you're not quite certain how to do that, there's an awareness of the danger if actually you're not able to navigate that social space. But then the impact that that has. And a lot of women, and I hope to be able to give more information with my own research, but also talk about not knowing who they are and a complete loss of self, because they've masked for so long, they're not really sure who they are anymore. And the idea of self is obviously highly complicated, and if you are somebody who predominantly thinks in very concrete ways, which is more common for those on the spectrum, it's really difficult to try and unpick who I am. So a lot of the work I do involves helping people to explore their diagnosis, explore their relationships, and explore when and how they mask and when they don't mask and what it means for them. And it's kind of really, really important work to do. Okay. Why gender and autism? So what I'll do is I'll keep on talking, and then we'll make sure that we have like 45 minutes, half an hour, we can just kind of open up and talk and share and ask questions and things. That would be great. So thinking about gender and autism, what I'm talking about here is the issues to do with gender identity. So evidence suggests that autistic people are more likely to identify outside of conventional genders and sexualities. So again, over the last 10 years, they've been looking at studies across the world actually. We've got some in Finland, we've got some in Australia, as well as the States. And there appears to be kind of consensus that individuals on the spectrum are much more likely to identify outside of the conventional, both gender and sexuality kind of paradigms. So they're more likely to be non-heterosexual or to have uncertainty or non-traditional ways of identifying. And also, there's a very large study done so George and Stokes last year did a study of over 9,000 people, and there was higher autism kind of traits within those with like homosexuality, bisexuality, asexuality. So looking at it the other way around, they were also seeing kind of this correlation. Let me throw some more numbers at you, just because I think it's quite interesting. Oh, this one's. I found this graphic and I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. I just think it's such a it's such a fabulous way of just capturing the different elements of it, because it's quite tricky to kind of pull apart. So the gender identity, which is how you think about yourself, and whether you see yourself as a woman, as a man, or as genderqueer, non-binary. Then your expression, whether you are actually dressing and presenting yourself in a masculine or feminine way. Then your biological sex, which obviously can vary in itself. Lots of people kind of think that this can vary, but your sex is just one or the other, and the fact that actually it's not at all. And it's way more complicated than that, I think, is a really important one. And then obviously that you're, this is where it's got touch. Oh yeah, I could have done that. Oh, now I know. And then your sexual orientation, which obviously again can vary totally separately to those things. I just love that graphic. Anyway, so looking at autism traits in gender different, gender diverse populations. So we've got in the UK individuals who are undertaking treatment. So if you're undertaking treatment, you've kind of gone down you've been diagnosed. So 5.5 even, with autism spectrum disorder traits compared to 0.5 to 2 in the general population. It's quite a significant difference. This is also mirrored in the Netherlands, where again they looked at diagnostically relevant traits. They actually had a higher criteria there. They were looking at those that would actually reach diagnosis, and they got 7.8. And then in Finland, it was mirrored again with a higher rate of 26. So that's looking at this issue one way around. Then the other way around, we see that when compared to developing
individuals, autistic individuals, have a higher number of gender dysphoric traits. And this, I think, is quite interesting, and it certainly mirrors my experience working clinically with people, is that autistic females in particular, so autistic natal females, have lower gender identification generally, so they're not identifying as having a gender, so non-binary at all, yeah. So either non-binary or gender neutral, in comparison to autistic natal males. So there seems to be kind of a particular experience for autistic natal females where they really are feeling, their experience is that they're not, they need to identify as non-binary. So they're less likely to affiliate with any gender group, but also more likely to have negative feelings about gender groups. So I think this kind of starts to highlight the difficulty that individuals are experiencing where they're both not identifying within normal, within conventional, traditional definitions, but also experiencing a lot of negative feelings around their gender identity and how they're being perceived.
When you say negative feelings about a gender group, would that mean about both gender groups, or
I
their own?
believe that's a typo, and it would be their own. So negative feelings about their own gender group if they define themselves as such, and then lower gender self-esteem. Yeah. Okay. So. One of the things that a lot of individuals I've worked with have explained to me, and is talked about in the literature as well, is that because they experience social interaction differently, autistic individuals experience social interaction differently, the unwritten invisible rules around gender, so how to be a woman, how to be a man, those they just never experienced or passed them by, or they never fitted into. So a lot of people will talk about, I just can't be a woman, how to be a woman doing womanly things, chatting and all sorts of things that women do, and this real sense of not being able to understand, access, or identify with all of that really kind of complicated, but also totally intuitive and invisible kind of social, gendered upbringing that goes on from when babies are first born. And, as a consequence of that, there is a real sense of both not identifying with it, but also not knowing how to do it right. And that can lead to lots of difficulties in terms of finding a sense of identity, a sense of meaning, finding a sense of place socially, because you're not able to slot into the kind of jigsaw puzzle that you see around you. One person that I work with describes, and I love this metaphor because I think it's brilliant, she said it's like there's a Wi-Fi, social Wi-Fi, and she can't wire in, she can't access it. So everyone else is like connected and doing all this stuff, and she's just not in it. And if you're not able to navigate that and negotiate that, what that means relationally, but also what that means in terms of your own sense of self. On the flip side, some will talk about real freedom in it. But there's not even a kind of question about, I don't think about things like that. I don't see it in that way. And another kind of interesting aspect where these elements combine, I think, is for women in particular, some of them will go through periods of copying other women intensely. So particularly around adolescence, they will study women in their girls in their school, and will try and, someone was telling me about this last week, will try and copy what they say, copy their mannerisms, copy what they're wearing, and try and mimic in order to be able to fit in and be safe. So there's a real sense of needing to do this for safety. And this will also include their appearance, so also learning how to do makeup in a certain way, or learning how to put your clothes on in a certain way, so that you're able to kind of do this, inhabit the full-on feminine role. Very often this might mean picking those girls who are kind of, the most popular, the most feminine. And then sometimes that will kind of not work, and so you end up switching and trying something else. But there's this sense of trying to inhabit a gender role that doesn't feel authentic, and then a real kind of incongruity as they develop, because there is an internal sense of not feeling themselves. Okay, so it's a really good piece of research that was done last year actually, looking at autism and LGBTQ issues. So a lot of people massively struggle with getting any difficulties they're experiencing acknowledged. So partly because of difficulties with communication anyway, but also, and I think this is a really pertinent point that I've seen, is that anyone who has a disability, the idea that they might be sexual, or that they might inhabit a kind of gendered sexual role, is often something that people can feel quite uncomfortable about. And there can sometimes be the idea that, they're supposed to kind of be, they're childlike, or they can't make decisions around this. And so any kind of experience they express around this is how I'm feeling about my gender, or this is how I'm feeling about my sexuality, might be kind of dismissed by family or professionals. I certainly know the difficulties in terms of working with individuals with autism who are wanting to find relationships, and how difficult that is when you're supporting someone without to affirm their rights and their needs as a sexual human being, but also navigate kind of risk issues professionally as a clinician. I've had many people who've basically asked me if I can pimp them out. In one way, shape or form. Can you find me a girlfriend, Ruth? Or where can I find a prostitute? And such things. So, acknowledging their needs as well as being realistic about what you can do is a tricky one. But there's a real issue around, and it's difficult for people in terms of stigma when it comes to non-traditional, conventional gender norms anyway, but particularly for autistic individuals it's really difficult. So, I'll just read this quote out to you. Growing up, everyone around me assumed I was a girl based on the genitals I was born with. But I always felt deeply uncomfortable with being labelled a girl or a woman. I don't feel like a woman, but I know I'm not a man either. I now identify as genderqueer or non-binary. Gender mostly impacts our lives when projected onto us through other people's assumptions, but holds little intrinsic meaning. And that last little bit really resonated with me because so many individuals that I work with will kind of echo something like that, where, for them it's just like, it isn't something, they don't see things in that way, or see individuals in that way, but they are aware of people's expectations and assumptions on them. Obviously, the online interactions puts another spin on this, because if you are doing a lot of your interactions online, you can choose often what your avatar is going to look like, what gender they might be, if they're not going to have a gender, if they're not even going to be a human. And lots of people will do a vast amount of their relational interactions online. And so it really kind of puts a different spin on this if you're not having to embody whatever physical being you have in your human world. So it's another really interesting experience. Just thinking about the combination of mental health and gender. So as anyone who's working in the kind of therapy or mental health arena, autistic individuals do have higher rates of anxiety, depression, other mental health disorders, and then if there are issues around the gender as well, they're kind of even more vulnerable because of what they're going through. Even more vulnerable to stigma, even more vulnerable. The rates around kind of if you are trans and the rates of kind of bullying and harassment are shocking. It's like 3 in 1 person has experienced a hate crime in the last 12 months. It's really bad. I looked at Stonewall recently. It's shocking. So if you're already, and again, if you're someone who's on the autistic spectrum, you are vulnerable because you can't necessarily interact and keep yourself safe. Again, the vulnerability is really high, and then the trauma that they experience from that is really high. So I think kind of as clinicians and practitioners, having a kind of just a real sense of what some of these people might be going through is really important. So this is just what I've just said here. So higher rates of levels of mood disorders, stress, depression, anxiety, lower well-being, double minority status, and the fact that because of this double minority status, it is really hard to find groups and support. It's incredibly, services are tough at the moment, to find services for children and for adults. And then if you've, if you're someone who's also got differences in your gender or maybe physical disability as well as your autism, finding safe spaces is really tricky. There aren't any, basically. Hence why we should be starting up a group here, which is very exciting. But there just isn't any safe spaces really for people. And also, I think very often people are highly competent and capable and present as being fine, and the level of distress that they're experiencing isn't necessarily obvious, particularly because some individuals on the spectrum may be really non-verbally non-expressive when it comes to how distressed they are. So they can become not picked up, I suppose, by services. Right, I'm going to talk a bit about best practice. This is actually from the latest NICE guidelines. So it's nice to know in theory what we're supposed to be doing. So the ideal is that if there is a co-occurrence of gender dysphoria or gender diversity and autism, that they would actually have specialist services in both. That is highly unlikely. If someone does have issues around their gender, then it would be going through GP for referral to a gender specialist clinic. And we are very lucky to have Professor Christine Richards, who's going to be talking in January. And she is one of the leading figures in the UK, and even more than that, in gender identity issues. She runs the maintenance down here. And she's absolutely fantastic. So it's brilliant to have her coming and chatting about this in much more depth than I will. So, although there is supposed to be this referral system, the provision just is really tricky. Ideally, they'd have an extended diagnostic period and adaptive assessments. And one of the issues around this is that concepts of identity and gender and what that means are obviously very abstract and can be very varied. And so part of working with someone who is experiencing these questions is being able to support them, to explore that in a way that is concrete, in a way that is perhaps visual, in a way that really allows them to understand what it means. You know, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean for me to get in touch with my masculinity? What would it feel like if I was to have top surgery? You know, what would it mean for me in terms of consequence? So for individuals on the spectrum who may find it difficult to work through consequence and work through you know, what some of these concepts really mean, a big part of the work is just actually mapping this out. And with individuals, I'll do kind of visual pieces of work where you're kind of going through their current social and relational circles. You know, who are they currently with? What are they like with them? And then you might do a whole piece of work again, you know, visually, which is looking at the different types of aspects of themselves and how they feel about it. So a lot of people who I work with we might end up doing linking it to animals or linking it to colours, and it'll be, you know, this is me when I'm feeling blue, this is me when I'm feeling like a hawk, and what that means in terms of their aspect of themselves, and then how that might link to you know, how they feel about their gender. So it's really kind of, you know, taking these kind of abstract ideas and transforming that into a way that relates to their way of processing. So for some of them that might be visual, others it will be associating it with their specialist interest. That can be a really helpful way of helping people to kind of work through and understand. And that takes a long time. I spoke at a conference a couple of weeks ago which was talking about autism and gender, and Mum came up to me afterwards and she spoke a little bit about her worries for her child who was going through questioning gender at the moment and was just referred to a clinic. And she was highlighting the mum was highlighting her concerns around, you know, my daughter doesn't really know, she doesn't understand this stuff, she doesn't know what she's doing, you know, I'm worried that she's going to end up kind of going down this path and, you know, she doesn't, you know, she just doesn't get it. And we were talking about how really all that needs to be happening initially is just allowing her to really explore this stuff in whatever way, you know, that means it makes no sense for her. And then if that leads to a clarity around wanting to change their gender in some way, then that can be supported too. So, it's quite a busy slide, but in terms of treatment, adaptations to psychoeducation, because that's a big part of the treatment for gender dysphoria. But that would need to be done, as I was mentioning, through real kind of use of images or literal language, and then providing structure, including around transition, including around, you know, what it means to actually dress like a woman, dress like a man, you know, what names you might want to use. So that would have to be something where you'd actually offer up ideas that would give them a sense of what it could look like. And we know that many autistic individuals struggle with making choices, and yet it's important that we acknowledge that they have agency and that they absolutely can and should make choices. And it's just about how we support them in doing that, rather than kind of shying away from allowing that. I think that's a really key thing. Sometimes it's really easy to say, oh, they don't really know what they're doing, therefore we won't give them a choice. And that happens a lot, I think. And actually, you know, that's, you know, it's not acceptable because it's purely the way that we're putting these choices the method of the medium that we're framing them in. So providing support in terms of making this understandable and intelligible to them. Providing teaching to the family as well and support around them. And then having to address stuff like sensory issues. So if they're taking hormones, or if they're having to have kind of, chicken fillets and all this kind of stuff, all these little things can make a massive difference if you've got sensory issues. Taking medication can be really tricky if you've got executive functioning differences and you struggle to remember to do things. And yet you have to take your hormone meds on time, otherwise it's going to cause problems. So again, this is kind of really simple stuff that needs to be addressed, otherwise that person won't be able to get the support and the treatment they deserve. I've touched about this one already, and it's just highlighting the higher risk of vulnerability for trans, non-binary and autistic women. Okay, I should finish and we can talk. So, in terms of what I've seen and what the kind of literature is highlighting at the moment, firstly there's a really big need for autism and queer-friendly spaces. So, somebody was sharing with me that there can be some awesome queer spaces, but they might be super noisy and or you're expected to do loads of talking and just can't do it. So as an autistic person, it's just not possible. It just can't happen. Obviously, better access to assessment and treatment. And as I mentioned, I don't know if any of you have experience of it at the moment, but I work with a lot of people who are having to battle with things like PIP and ESA and benefits at the moment, and it is excruciating for people like that. It's really tough. And so, access to the services is just really, really hard. We absolutely need more research. And also more awareness. It's such a buzzword at the moment, but intersectionality, which has been talked a lot about, but in terms of I can have a disability and I can be queer, and I might come from the ME community, and all of these things need to be considered if you're going to see me as a whole person. And it just doesn't happen that often. It really doesn't. And really being able to identify, the particular experience of being in the world if you are coming from these different aspects and what that means, in the same way that, each of us, our way of being with people and our experience is completely coloured by the kind of Venn diagram that is the bits that make us up. But I will stop there, and we'll chat and have some questions about. I'm happy to answer any questions around autism and gender, but just anything that comes up for people. Quite happy. We've got half an hour and a bit, so we've got lots of time. Any thoughts? Anything that kind of comes to mind? Any questions? I wait the silence that always occurs.
I guess one issue came up for me was a little bit about consent.
Yeah.
A lot of parents will argue that their children with autism spectrum disorders aren't able to give valid consent. And one of the common arguments, one argument sometimes made, is that the child is under the influence of somebody else. Or has got under the influence of some kind of movement. Now, I think some people with autism are more susceptible to outside influence, more vulnerable in that way.
Yeah.
So, if a parent says he or she has got this idea that they're non-gender, but it's actually because of that person they've been hanging around with at school, or they've been reading this horrible magazine, I don't know where they get these things from. How would you deal with that.
It's a really, I mean, it's absolutely the case, and as you say, they often are more vulnerable to outside influence because they're not necessarily aware of the person's intentions. I mean, from my point of view, the first step when you get something like that is to work with the individual and find out what's going on and allow them the chance to really explore what's happening and understand, if there is somebody who is having influence in their life, okay, who is this person, what do you think of them, what might their intentions be, and start to kind of really, open up what's happening so that person is able to then, is then better able to make a choice. Obviously, if there's someone who doesn't have the capacity for consent, so if they are deemed to be without the capacity for consent, then that is a different issue, and we would be looking to parents or caregivers to inform their choice. But if they are deemed to have capacity, then I think it's really important to support, that young person, that adult, to understand their situation better. But bearing in mind that they are, are highly vulnerable, and it's important, not to forget that. I mean, I've also worked with lots of people who, who would come on their own, as in they don't have parents or carers. It's, them on their own as an individual with consent and capacity. So with those guys, it doesn't really have quite the same influence, but certainly for the population you're talking about, I do think it's important not to dismiss straight away. I suppose that's where I'm coming from, but I agree that there is a real vulnerability that needs to be taken seriously.
And we don't have long-term follow-up of the outcome of gender.
Well, I don't know actually. We have to ask Christina that. Is that your understanding that there isn't follow-up at the moment as to what happens? There's not many studies,
Well,
that's true.
I think at the moment it's largely anecdotal.
Yeah.
The support will be always for it being successful, because that's the way things are at the moment. But it's typical when you do something new, it always seems a lot more successful than it turns out to be in the long term, and there are more side effects than you expect. And I don't think there's been enough change, and of course not enough change by people who aren't strong-willed enough to have driven, some kind of reassignment or reassignation. So I don't think there is any reliable evidence.
I think that's why it's really important, though, to have discussions that are outside of that gender binary. So talking about trans identities that are non-binary ones, because I know several people who have said that they fully transitioned, but actually if there had been more dialogue around gender queerness or gender non-binary identities, that they might not have made as full a transition. Not that they regret it, but that perhaps there hasn't been as much dialogue or awareness, and a lot more kind of phobia actually around those kinds of identities that also allow people to play with different gender identities without necessarily taking specific steps. So I think it's really important to kind of open up the dialogue to those identities much more.
I remember being lectured by a guy about 15 years ago about how my thinking is sort of so rigid, and I have to want him to put him into a gender, and he seems to be living a very non-gendered life and very happy about it. But he was also, in a funny way, his head was very together. He sort of thought things through quite a bit, to the extent that he didn't really mind being a bit of a mess occasionally. He didn't mind the kind of personal chaos that sometimes resulted. It was all worth it. So I'm sure there are good outcomes, and I'm sure you're right. We should consider. We shouldn't foreclose on people's options. But I think, as I say, I think it's important to But a lot of parents feel this is very threatening. And sometimes I think they might be right, sometimes I think they're overreacting.
I mean, it highlights the importance, I think, of working often with the family about issues like that if it's appropriate, because I think it is really threatening and scary. And, if you're talking about transitioning, that journey is huge. And kind of acknowledging that, I think, is really important. But what's interesting in terms of the non-binary dialogue is that it appears to relate particularly to the female natal autistics, because that seems to be what they're saying, which is it's not that they want to transition, it's just that they just don't see themselves in that mindset. In one of our women's groups, it's slightly different, but it made me smile, so I'll share it with you. This week, they ended up talking about sex, and one of them was just saying how sex was. And they said, who here would just rather they didn't have sex? And about 20 women put their hands up. So, such a pain in the bum. One of them had just brought their tiny baby in, so they were denied that. And there was who here hasn't had sex in ages as well. I mean, that's a slightly different kettle of fish, because for a lot of autistic people, like the sensory elements of sex can be really challenging. And also the ideas that it has to be done in this particular way. So again, like thinking about sexuality and thinking about it as in a much more kind of fluid and much more accommodating way is really important. But I think this is interesting, the non-binary stuff with the autism, because it means that you don't have to go down prescribed routes of hormones or surgery, which obviously does have risks. It does. So. But
you seem to be saying then that this is particularly so for people with autism, because they tend to be black or white about things, and so it's necessary to help them realise that it doesn't have to be you're male or female.
Exactly.
So to actually educate and open up options,
Exactly.
and open the idea that you can play with it, and you could be one thing one day and another thing the other day. You don't have to make up your mind straight away.
Exactly. And I think that's such an important, dialogue to have with an autistic individual anyway. That actually you don't have to be one thing. It's really kind of, exciting and powerful.
But is it true? I mean, do we have evidence that when people who have questions about their gender or their sexuality, if they're autistic, they will tend to jump to conclusions about it, go one way or the other? Do we know this for a fact or not?
A good point. We don't. I'm not aware of any.
We don't have that research.
Any data. I know that.
That's what we would expect.
When talking with my colleagues who are diagnosticians kind of around the southeast of London, they talk about this issue of people kind of, seeing it in black and white terms, and it's kind of linked into why they talk in the guidelines around having conversations about it. But I don't believe there's been any research yet. So,
or is it more like a social pressure on them that they feel like
I should be
that they have to stick to one or another theory?
Yeah.
I was also thinking about, because there's this theory that the autistic brain is very masculine.
Yes.
So do you think that it might have something to do with female gender and binary?
Yes.
Stuff,
Very interesting. You're spot on. So the extreme male brain theory, DB, can you tell me if I'm getting this wrong? So the
extreme
male brain
It's
theory.
collapsing.
Yes.
Yes.
It is. Yeah.
It's collapsing partly because it offends a lot of people that the brain is gendered in that way, and partly because, in fact, the evidence isn't very strong. For example, there was a significant study recently that showed that testosterone doesn't make men more like engineers, and it's just not the case. So it was a good idea at the time, and like a lot of things, a lot of research seemed to bear it out, but then I don't think it's really. And some people say that actually, some small bit of evidence that the women's brains are different, but they're different. men's brains as well. They're different in a different way, uniquely female way. So again, that doesn't. But I think it's too early to tell. But I think the whole female-male brain and systematising and empathising and all that stuff, I think that's all starting to fragment.
Yeah. And in terms of, and what's interesting in terms, because they have linked it, or some have tried to link it in with the natal women being more masculine. But then again, it just doesn't seem to quite hold water, because autistic men are not more masculine. Autistic men are actually, yeah, they can be often quite feminine. So it doesn't seem to kind of quite work. There's something that isn't, and it links to the fact that actually.
But I mean, like a specific, like maybe male way of thinking and categorizing the world. You know,
Yeah.
autistic couple.
But why do we call that?
Male.
Male.
I mean, this is another thing that's come through is looking kind of globally, and the idea of systematising being masculine is obviously massively culturally biased, because not everywhere is systematising seen as masculine.
Yeah.
So, you know, for me, I'm hands up will highlight that I'm not a massive fan of
Well,
this.
there's no evidence that men are more systemic than women.
But there was a great mass of evidence apparently, but that no longer seems to be sustained by replications.
But in terms of gender difference that have been proven over and over again, it's only the thing about aggression, isn't it?
No, it's about this whole systematising, empathising difference. And you know, there were neat graphs showing that women with autism were over here with the engineers and men, and they all studied STEM subjects, and over here with the women who were, you know, empathising and sort of encouraging and all that.
The other thing I would bang in here, just to be further irritating, is obviously how those women were identified, autistic women. There's a kind of question mark around that, because the assessments to find individuals with autism are massively male biased, because they were created by predominantly male populations. So you've got you're skewed in terms of, and it's only now we're looking at trying to make sure that the actual assessment for whether you have autism is actually non-male biased, because previously it's been predominantly male populations. So there's a real kind of, I'm just putting it in there, but there's a real kind of tricky bit in terms of in terms of what we're actually seeing with some of this data. So it's I think there's just a huge question mark over it, and I think we need to be really cautious with what we take. But in terms of what we're hopefully going to get to in the next kind of 5-10 years is a much more nuanced view of autism.
Yes, that's the thing. It's no simplicity.
Exactly. Which really looks at the different ways that you present, how that links into somebody's gender, or how that links into other aspects, their IQ, their intelligence, their ability to communicate. We need to have a much more nuanced view.
Just in terms of your introductory thing about diagnosis,
Yeah.
there are very different presentations and ways of being.
Completely.
If you have a lot more repetitive activity, for example, and
Yeah.
a lot less of this and so on. So
Yeah.
it's we're still at a very simple stage.
Yeah.
I think autism has been one thing and fundamentally associated with one kind of cause or one kind of certainly one kind of brain. So, but at least out of all of that came a recognisable condition, which probably in the main has helped people to say, oh, this is autism, because it's helped lead to people looking at specific adaptations that you've been doing tonight, and also the concept of neurodiversity. I think is something of a breakthrough.
Absolutely.
Neurodiversity and gender diversity.
Well, that's what I was going to say. All these things are seen as a
diversity.
spectrum. It's an autism spectrum, it's a gender spectrum, it's a sexuality spectrum. And I
Yeah.
find that so interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does get very complicated. then, isn't it? Where on the spectrum are you with this, with that, and it's more than that. It's not just about autism, not autism or male or female.
Well,
it's about so many other
I know plenty of
things.
people in the queer community who don't like calling it a spectrum because it's so oversimplistic. Again, it's still basically a binary type of It's like you think of it as a rainbow, and it does. It's still kind of moving.
3D fractal image or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you're only thinking about yourself on that particular spectrum.
Well, and it's 2D, and there's not kind of other bits of it. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no. It's just very simplistic.
Absolutely.
You're not going in the round anymore. You're just having one slice through who you are.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I also think what we've talked about today, which is the fact that we can move. I think that's really important because it's so
again
often.
And again and again.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
Exactly. Because I think it's so often, we get to we think, oh yeah, there's this, and then
fixated.
Yeah.
and it's just one of the and that's something that for when we were talking about this idea of thinking in black and white terms with individuals with autism, and this idea of this is who I am, and working with people to realise that it's okay for them to move and to be different things, and that is there's allowing them to have the flexibility for that is something that is really important, because that's often where this distress happens, because they're not what they're supposed to be, and that's what leads to crisis very often. And I was chatting with a young woman, and she said, how did she describe it? See if I can get it right. My real fake self. And what she was saying was, she was like, yeah, sometimes I mask, but that's okay. I'm not going to get hung up on that. That's who I am. And if I stop trying to do that, then that will be even less who I am. So actually, yeah, it's my real fake self. And she had a real sense of ease around it, and it was lovely speaking to her, because she was chatting about a lot of her peers really struggle with this idea of who they are and what they're supposed to be. And she said that actually she's kind of come through it, and now it's just like whatever, screw it if people don't like me. And it was just really lovely and refreshing. But it just shows about having this ability to kind of be both, which I think from a from a therapeutic point of view really clicks into the way I think anyway, that sometimes we're putting it on and sometimes we're not, and sometimes I'm feeling like this and sometimes I'm not, and it's okay for me to move. But then of course the tricky thing is, and I think this is the additional component that has a particular resonance with individuals with autism, is how you manage that in terms of your relations with others. Because in order for us to be able to move around and to be different things, we also need to be able to navigate and accommodate the other people in our lives and how they deal with that. And if you're autistic, that's a minefield. Like, it's a nightmare trying to figure out what's going on with you, and then how do I deal with my loved ones about the fact, when I can't maybe even put it into words. When I get into the room and I go completely, end up having a meltdown. So. And that often requires quite a lot of scripting. So actually going through, you can say this, you can say that. Might be doing drawings, all sorts of things in order to give them the weight of them being able to.
But that's again about multiplicity, about not having one script, but claiming the right to have multiple scripts and being able to adjust in different environments, bringing out different aspects of it.
And I think what this links into also, which for me is always really important, is, as you said, claiming the right.
Yeah.
And that I think is really big, because anyone who's in a minority status, so if you're autistic and if you're, genderqueer or whatever, there is a huge issue about claiming the right to be, very fundamentally, and actually knowing that I'm allowed to make those choices, because from an institutional, systemic, societal level, I don't care. I'm going to say it. It's still really, there's still massive stigma and discrimination out there.
Sure.
And so people do not feel like they're able to actually say. So that's often a really important part of working with this kind of individuals.
I think
of struck me throughout your presentation, and it almost feel it like riling up inside me, how so much of this as an issue is just purely societal. And like you have on the board right now, making queer spaces more ASD friendly, but if the world was more ASD friendly and queer friendly and everything friendly, but it's just not. And at least in our societies, I think I say it wrong.
This is different words.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure there will be some that are better, and it's like different multiple ways of being are more accepted, and people are taken in each moment. This is a paradise, I think, that I always have in my head, but never have seen. There's a society where you accept each person in each moment as whichever being they are right there. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go find that place.
So it's like neurotypical brains limitations.
Absolutely.
You're speaking about limitations of autistic brains, but I don't know how many limitations that
Absolutely.
people have.
It's also an intrinsic limitation of what society is, isn't it? What society is a schema by which we organize things so that things become predictable. So the moment you do that, you're stuck with that organization. You might change the organization, which is called revolution, but you're still stuck with a new organization which becomes oppressive, especially of people who don't fit into those nice tight little squares everywhere. But that's what a society does. It's a frame. It's a bit like, when you learn math in school, you learn to fit things into these square boxes, a number per box. And that's what a society does. It puts us in these boxes, and you learn to choose which boxes you can inhabit and which you don't like. But if you're not willing to fit into them, you're in trouble.
Absolutely. I think it's, as you say, it is this tension between, because there's a fundamental tension between the fact that we both want security and structure and the fact that we don't. And I think, again, with autism, there's a particular kind of piquancy with that, with the fact that, there's a sense of wanting to have routine and structure, but there's that continual tension. And then how we navigate that. And when I'm working with some people who might not have a distinct love of others, let me just say, why do I have to talk to people, Ruth? It's so awful. I'm like, I know, but you live in a world with other people. You are going to have to go outside at some point, so you need to be able to navigate those spaces when you need to. And that is dealing with that. It's like, okay, how do I navigate that? You may be able to do a lot of the stuff you want online, and that's fine, that's your choice, but you can't completely obfuscate your ability, your necessity of being in the world, and you've got to deal with how you then interact with that. And this kind of awareness of this tension, I think particularly really strange to my mind kind of societal place right now when it comes to labels and groups and we're in this kind of, and so it feels like there's a particular kind of resonance with all the stuff we're talking about now and how we manage it. And I feel like kind of as professionals, there's a need to kind of keep ourselves grounded within this, because there just seems to be, I'm not quite articulating it well, but
I think you're searching for something there, though, because as an old person, I know that 40 years or 50 years ago, there were far fewer labels and fewer structures than there are now.
Exactly.
But that cuts both ways.
Yes.
So in the 50s, for instance, or you will agree with me, I'm sure, in the early 60s, my memory is of society being so regulated and so straight, as it were, that there were hardly any choices. And what we did at the end of the 60s was to try to overthrow that, to get our freedom back, because we were literally pressed into a very tight frame. But what has happened since then is that we've replaced those very big square things with lots of little ones. And there's so many options and so many choices that I think it's even harder in a way. you have even less freedom because you constantly have to choose, am I this or am I that? And whereas in those days, it was just horrible, wasn't it? It was like, you're either this or you're that, and what are you going to do? And, you know, there were no choices. You had to do it, or you were out.
Yeah, exactly. And but I think what you say about now, we've just got lots of little boxes.
Yes.
It's spot on.
It's more complicated, but more free in some ways than we were, definitely.
Without a doubt. I mean, just it's a slightly different example, but I think it's relevant here. You know, if you were an autistic person in the 50s, you'd either be in an institution somewhere, or you'd be in prison.
Mute most of the time.
Yeah. So I've worked with a number of people who used to be in Broadmoor, and were in Broadmoor for goodness knows how many years because they were autistic, and then finally, kind of as older people, finally kind of released. One person who had actually, through his self-harm, completely disconnected his retina and was totally blind because he'd just the distress of being in Broadmoor so many years. So, you know, that in the 50s and 60s it was...
Yes. But one of the things that Digby taught me is that it's different in the UK than in other countries, because in the UK there's always been this thing of the English eccentric. So there was a kind of category in the UK, and when I came to the UK in the 70s, and when I met you in the 80s, I sort of understood that there were these people, you said, you know, had Asperger's syndrome, who people had thought of as eccentric, rather than having been hospitalized or turned into autistic people. That was already something that was quite well developed in the UK, when I didn't know that in the Netherlands or in France or in other places. It just didn't exist in the same way.
Very, very true.
You still occasionally meet people who have always been eccentric, and somebody thought they ought to stop being eccentric and become autistic.
Wow.
Often actually because of inheritance or some family circumstances change and they need a diagnostic label.
I work with a guy who was in his 80s, who is autistic genuinely, but I mean, just recently had his diagnosis, and he is extraordinary, but he does have a canoe in his living room.
In which he sits.
I don't even know if he sits in it, I'm not honest. I think there's a number of very, very strange items filling his house. But yeah, he got his diagnosis when he was in the late 70s. So yeah, he's wonderful. But he definitely fit into that. Not at all.
Go back to this question of diversity, because we spoke about things being merely social conventions or merely social restrictions. We were kind of recognising that they serve some social purpose.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm not sure there's so much difference between cognitive categories and social categories. In some ways, social categories enact or embody, or embody is not the word, but concretise, reify cognitive categories. So what you're speaking about is a small number of people currently saying, let's do away with this distinction between men and women. Let's not say that's a fixed distinction anymore. Now I think that would have, let's say if we adopted that would have a massively far-reaching effect, not just on social arrangements, but on cognitive arrangements. So much of what we structure our ideas around, let alone our relationships, is about gender, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, and I think that's what people with autism are actually requiring of us, and in that sense are agents for quite significant social change. I mean, obviously Silicon Valley and all that comes to mind as well. But changing social arrangements. So I think we can expect really quite a lot of social change as a result simply of people questioning these very fundamental categories.
Well, more communal living rather than living in families or groups of,
Yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, divorcing your parents, we came across that twice this morning in the ethics committee, I think. Yeah. So, who came up with that idea? Well, I could imagine it quite easily be somebody with autism saying, well, if parents can, divorce each other, why can't children divorce them? And, one of the things about people with autism, once they get a very rational idea like that, they don't let it go.
No.
And then, especially if it gets tied up with justice, well, isn't it fair that children should be able to divorce their parents? Surely you can see that's just natural justice.
Exactly.
It has a real place.
Definitely. It's interesting you also say about communal living, because one of the things that I would like to, at some point, do some more research on is around polyamory. Which is
changing families, structure.
Exactly. Because quite again, this is anecdotal, but I work with quite a few people who are in polyamorous relationships who are autistic, but it may be that they're all neurodiverse in different ways. So somebody might be kind of, ADHD, there'll be another person who's kind of, dyslexic or dyslexic, and then you've got some, bit of autism thrown in there, and they've created an arrangement in terms of living, in terms of kids, that is just much more nuanced, fluid. It links to what's going on with the kids, what's happening with family, and it's really interesting because it just brings up obviously there are pros and cons with everything, but it is a really fresh way of thinking about how we relate and how we socially interact, how we divide labour. So, for example, they'll share childcare, when it comes to holidays and things like that, and older mum and dad care, that kind of thing. It's really interesting, but as far as I'm aware, there's not been we haven't got any research on it at the moment, I don't think. But it definitely kind of makes you question.
For good. Start questioning things, start to.
No.
Don't stop questioning of that kind either.
I know, because there isn't any definitive end. That's the problem. And then we get into real problems.
Ruth, do you know if there's any research around natal females with ASD in terms of coming out later? I'm just wondering if, because there's the tendency to camouflage, whether that would impact queer natal females with an ASD.
Young women are much later diagnosed.
No, I mean coming out as queer.
Oh, it's queer.
Yeah. Whether that happens later for women with an ASD because of camouflaging.
Then for women who are straight.
Then for men with an ASD and for women who are
well, don't forget that young women in the early teens suffer a cold storm of social normalisation in the way that young men don't. So, I mean, coming out when you're 12 and 13 would be very, very difficult, I think, for most young women. And that's not so uncommon for young men, is it, to come out when they're 12 and 13.
No.
I mean, they do get...
You mean just across the board?
Not
autistic or neurodivergent?
I mean, the short answer, Sash, is that there isn't any research in that yet. I do think it's a really interesting point in terms of the camouflaging. As you say, the social milieu for teenage girls is just intense.
It seems to be young teens, isn't it? 10 to 12, 10 to 13 especially.
Yeah, absolutely. So, having said that, again, for the generation that are coming up now, this idea of pansexuality and non-binary, it appears to be something that they're talking about more and more and more, and are kind of
younger.
Not sure I got round to it in Sheffield much.